We're going to begin panel discussion with the topic Producing Useful Pension Accounting Information. The chair of the panel discussion is Professor Jung of Chung-Ang University. He served as Chief Director of GAFSC, KIPF, and is the first Korean member of IPSASB. Also, as a member of Central Government Accounting System Deliberation Committee member, he is contributing greatly to standard setting for public sector accounting home and abroad. Professor Jung, please briefly introduce the panelists. Good afternoon. My name is Chung Do-jin. This is a great honor and pleasure to be the chair of this meaningful panel discussion. Let me briefly introduce the panelists. 4 speakers who made presentations and 2 panelists. First, I'm going to briefly introduce the 4 speakers. Professor Andreas Bergman of Zurich University of Applied Sciences, Senior Manager Fabienne Colignon of CNoCP France, Professor Ryota of Kokugakuin University of Japan, and Professor Hwan from Graduate School of Public Administration of Seoul National University. And we also have 2 other discussants. Deputy General Manager Seung of Government Employees Pension System of Korea is with us. The GEPS is specialized in operating public officials' pension of Korea and researching relevant schemes. It is an accounting entity that belongs to government financial statements. Deputy General Manager Paik is in charge of fiscal estimation and pension scheme in Pension Research Institute of GEPS. I'm certain that he can offer insights about the current issues from the frontline perspective. Last but not least, Program and Technical Director Ross Smith of IPSASB. As you know, the IPSASB is an organization that corresponds to the IASB that establishes IFRS for the private sector. IPSASB sets IPSAS, an international accounting standard for the public sector. Mr. Ross Smith has been working on public sector accounting standards for 7 years based on his experience at a Canadian accounting firm and currently serves as Program and Technical Director, supervising international public sector accounting standards that are being developed. He is a genius from my personal point of view. Now, let's start panel discussion of the first KIPF Public Sector Accrual Accounting International Symposium. We already provided predetermined questions to the panelists. First question we provided to the panelists is the progresses of their public accounting scheme, current issues, impact of accrual accounting, future direction, and what would be the useful public accounting information. So these are the major questions we provided to the panelists in advance. Due to the limitations of this online meeting, we are going to take turns among panelists, and 6 minutes are given to each of the panelists. First, Senior Manager Fabienne Colignon of CNoCP France. What would be the current issues of pension accounting in France?
Thank you. The current issues at the moment are that, well, given the overall political context in France and the accounting framework we account for transactions under, and providing information on the amount of the commitment in future periods in the notes to the central government financial statement is an accounting treatment that is consistent with how we interpret the accrual accounting overall framework that we work under. I'm not aware actually that there is any will from political decision makers to make a move towards recognizing liability for states from public servants, state civil servants into the financial statements. And again, that comes from what I explained earlier, the way we are organized here. From an accounting standpoint, again, the reporting entity central government only operationalize the system, and it is mainly driven by annually voted expenditures and levels of contributions to serve the pensions due in the period. Therefore, from the angle of recognizing rights and obligation, there is no present obligation of the central government for a commitment for future pensions. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the context we're in. So the current issue is not really, as I said earlier in the presentation, on the central government's balance sheet. It's more to do, because again, the information is there in the notes, and it's in accordance with the requirements in IPSASB 39, using the credit method unit and the measurement requirements. The issue we face is more specifically on the social security sector, where we do not have forward-looking information, because it's mainly based as provided for in IPSASB 42 on period reporting, and there is no liability here for the future pensions. So it's really providing consistency between the central government and the social security sector in terms of disclosing information. And this is what we think people would need in terms of financial information in the social security sector. It would be really to enhance consistency between information provided for the central government and in the social security sector. So if that makes sense to you.
Thank you, Fabienne. 우리 역시 정보 회계를 하는 사람이든 제작.
Yes, information consistency is really important value we need to achieve from accounting perspective and also from financial perspective. The pension schemes and accounting schemes need to be established based on the history and context of different countries. So we learned a lot of insights from Senior Manager Fabienne. The example of France also about the European continent. Thank you again, Ms. Fabienne.
Next, I would like to ask for the comment from Professor Bergman. For your information, Professor Bergman is well recognized on this field, and he has also the experience in the actual practices. Therefore, junior professors respect him so much. So he is a very important person, so I'm very honored to have him in our symposium. In Switzerland, there was a change from the recognizing provisions in the note to recognizing them in the BS. I think this is a very significant change. So I wonder what is the reaction in Switzerland towards the change, and I hope that you will answer my questions that I raised before. Professor Bergman?
Thank you very much for this question. And in fact, this change only happened 10 years after implementing accrual accounting. So we implemented accrual accounting in 2007, and only in 2017 we actually recognized the pension obligation in accordance with IPSAS 39. What made that possible is really that the biggest concern we had went away. All plans in Switzerland are hybrid plans. So there is risk sharing in all plans. Plans without risk sharing are illegal in Switzerland. So therefore, we really needed to have a standard which allows us to mirror that risk sharing, because otherwise we would either understate or overstate the liability, and that would not be acceptable from a perspective of the user of the financial statement. So only when the ISB and subsequently the IPSASB allowed for that risk sharing and for that kind of accounting which is needed, we could implement that. And that was really the biggest concern we had, and which went away, fortunately. Right now, the focus is more on the basic pension, so on the social benefits. We are really working hard on implementing IPSAS 42 starting from next year on. And there, we also struggle with some issues. As you have heard in my presentation, the requirement for the recognition of a liability is that all eligibility criteria are fulfilled. This sounds very logical and very simple, but in practice it is not. Because the problem is that very similar schemes have very different eligibility criteria in Switzerland. So some schemes have a lot and very detailed recognition criteria, which leads to virtually zero liability. And some other schemes have a very broad definition of the eligibility, which leads to quite a large liability. And sometimes the one with the large liability is actually the smaller scheme than the one with the small liability, which is a bit contradictory. And that's really one of the issues we are facing now in implementing IPSAS 42, starting from next year on.
When the pension schemes were created in the beginning, I think that the makers of the pension scheme did not take into consideration accounting standards, but rather, while accounting for the pension schemes, as Professor Bergman mentioned, so it will be very difficult to apply the universal accounting standard to so different kinds of pension schemes. Maybe later I will ask Professor Bergman to give additional comment.
다음은 일본.
So I would like to ask the question to Professor Ryota. What are the current status in Japan, Professor Ryota? Multiple schemes were integrated into welfare or employee pension. Did pension accounting affect such reform? I think this is the question we get a lot from the audience. So please provide your comments and also what you think about the useful accounting information we need to provide. Thank you. And also future direction.
So now, yeah. So I know that many of you, the audience is from the Korean public officials. So at first, I like to talk about our pension system reform, and the pension system for Japan and Japanese public officials and private school employees were unified into one system, one welfare pension system for all employees in 2015. And since then, all employee pensions have been disclosed in the pension special account. And the overall status of pension employees are easier to understand than before. But the integration of employee pensions did not change accounting standards. Even before the integration, pension for the public officials is considered as a social benefit and not as an employee's benefit. So in circumstance, the pension system is almost the same, but the public officials have to give up some of the sort of privileges or benefits better than the private sector employees, but they had to give up. Yeah. And speaking of retirement benefits for public officials, yeah, we public officials can get the one-time severance pay when they retire. And these retirement benefits are recorded in each ministries and each special account financial statement as a liability. It's different from public pension liability. It's more like the employees, the provision of employees' benefit. And it's almost the same before and after 2015. It doesn't, and the pension system reform doesn't affect our severance-based system. And actually, the public officials and private school employees consist only around 10% of our workforce. So it's a small percentage. Yeah. And so now the issue is 20 years have passed since we adopt the accrual-based disclosure. So after that, we have had some revisions, but I think it's time to overhaul the whole accounting system. Does it make sense?
네,
Yes, thank you.
로타 교수님,
Thank you, Professor Ryota. We are following you. And would you please continue?
Okay, so after the application of accrual accounting, the role of accounting professions here in Japan, has increased. But still, accounting has a very limited role especially in this pension area. So, and then usually the policymakers don't use these accrual-based information so much. So it's the issue for the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor 로타. 로타 교수님 마지막에
As Professor Rota mentioned in the end of his comments, it is really important that policymakers need to utilize accrual-based accounting information to the fullest. So those who study IPSAS and accrual-based accounting, this is a homework and challenge for us to address. We have esteemed presenters here, and your effort will make great contribution to addressing this challenge, I think. So I think it's really inspiring to discuss about this issue together. Basic information. Actually, in Korea, the general public has great interest in public officials' pension. That's why we invited Mr. Seung from GEPS. What about the current status in Korea?
Deputy Director Paik, can you share with us Korea's situation? He prepared some slides, so he will explain using the slides. On behalf of the Ministry of Personnel Management, which oversees the public officials' pension, and GEPS, which operates the pension, I would like to discuss the key issues of pension accounting and useful accounting information in consideration of the purposes and characteristics of the public officials' pension. As stated in Article 1 of the Public Officials Pension Act, the purpose of the public officials' pension is to contribute to stabilizing the livelihood of public officials or their survivors and improving their welfare by paying appropriate benefits for the retirement, disability, or death of public officials and providing welfare services to them. This indicates that the public officials' pension has the characteristic of social security system, which protects public officials from an accident that occurs during their service or loss of income after their retirement. The rationale proposed for the enactment of the Public Officials Pension Act was the pension's goal is to reward the contribution made by public officials during their service and to make them do their best to fulfill their duties by paying them or their surviving families with installment or lump sum benefits when they retire after serving for a period of time or retire due to an injury or a disease or die during their service. This suggests that the public officials' pension is aimed to reward public officials' hard work and pay them post-retirement remuneration. It can be said that the Public Officials Pension of Korea is a comprehensive social protection measure that has the characteristics of social safety net and the characteristics of personnel policy and remuneration to improve administrative efficiency of public officials. Introduced in 1960, the public officials' pension had accumulated a significant size of fund, but the fund size shrank dramatically due to mass retirement of public officials amid the financial crisis in 1997 to 1998. With the revision of the Public Officials Pension Act in 2000, a shortfall in the pension fund should be filled by the nation by law. We can say that public officials' pension made a traditional transition of a public pension plan from funded scheme to unfunded scheme. Since 2001, the Public Officials Pension Fund plays a role of risk reserve or loss reserve. Given these characteristics of public officials' pension, there are some key issues according with the pension accounting. So given these characteristics of public officials' pension, let me discuss the key issues with pension accounting and what would be useful accounting information. As discussed in the country presentations, and especially as duly pointed out by Professor Kim, it will be necessary to distinguish the social insurance element and employee benefit element in accounting information. The Public Officials Pension of Korea has characteristics of both social insurance and employee benefit. To provide more useful accounting information on the pension, in view of what was previously suggested today, it would be important to reflect the element of exchange transaction and that of a non-exchange transaction within the Public Officials Pension separately in the FS. Of course, this will require in-depth discussion and study on the right approach, which can address the complexity of the system caused by a series of pension reforms. As I understand, international organizations such as the IMF recommend recognizing a provision for a public official's pension which has characteristics of employee benefits of defined benefit plan, regardless of whether the pension is funded or unfunded scheme. I think it's necessary to consider if such an approach is appropriate. The intended purpose of recognizing a provision for pension is to measure liabilities during a public official's service against future uncertainty in payment ability and to induce accumulation of fund corresponding to the liability, thus ensuring stable retirement of a public official. As far as I understand, various funded type public pension plans see the fund reserve rate against the liability as a key financial indicator. For a public pension plan based on pay-as-you-go method, where the pension fund works as a loss reserve and where the nation is obligated to ensure benefit payment by law, accounting information that shows the income and expenditures or the nation's payment ability would be more useful for public makers and citizens. Policy to change depending on changing environment. I believe more useful and worthy accounting information for a pension is the one that shows more reasonably the characteristics of a pension scheme that has developed amid diverse political and social environment and contributes to the improvement of the scheme. With that, let me finish my comment. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Beck. As Deputy Director Beck mentioned, there are views that pension provisions should not be recognized as liability all the time. That was pointed out by Professor Bergman, and it seems that people are thinking about how to provide such information in the notes.
So I'd like to ask the same questions to Director Ross Smith from a perspective of international accounting standard setter. What would be the current issues of pension accounting? Director Ross?
Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for having me here today and for giving me the opportunity to speak. And also thank you for the very kind introduction, Mr. Jung. In terms of the first question I'd like to answer, I think many of the speakers before me have already touched on a few of the issues, so I won't go into too much depth on the current issues of concerns. But I think the key issues and concerns that we hear the most about relate to how to appropriately account for shared risk plans as well as hybrid pensions. And the good news from an accounting standards perspective is both the private and public international standards have largely dealt with the key concerns in both those areas, with the update of IPSAS 39 employee benefits based on IAS 19 employee benefits, which deals with key features and risks related to shared risk plans by introducing specific requirements and principles around accounting for employee and third-party contributions, conditional indexation, limits to employer contributions, and changes to levels of benefits. So from an accounting standards perspective, that was a real improvement in the guidance around accounting standards. However, we do note in many jurisdictions in the public sector in particular that many jurisdictions are still using national standards and not on the international standards yet. So often those issues still exist at the national level. And I come from Canada, for example, and I know in Canada, the national standard sector in Canada is still dealing with the shared risk issue in Canada and getting their national standards right. So we'll see where the national jurisdictions end up on that. In relation to the hybrid pension schemes, IPSAS 42 social benefits deals with the types of transactions which generally fit in the social security type schemes and now covers the guidance on that. Although it's new and just being implemented, and as Professor Bergman's noted, jurisdictions are still coming to terms on how to account for those types of schemes. But the guidance is principle based and does give the requirements for jurisdictions to try and bring those on balance sheet, as well as disclose the nature of those types of schemes. The other issue that does come up quite often that I did want to highlight that has come up through various presenters today is the issue of discount rates. This can be a very challenging practical issue in the public sector, especially given the current environment that we're in internationally of low and negative interest rate environments, which give rise to larger pension liabilities. As well, the unstable rate environment we've experienced the last couple of years has meant a lot of volatility to the pension liability, as well as the changes in remeasurements of those liabilities in the statement of net assets equity and IPSAS set of financials. And another practical issue we hear about quite often is just in the public sector, how to identify that appropriate discount rate to reflect the time value of money in the public sector. That can be a more practical challenge and a little more challenging than in the private sector side of things, where you have a large market of corporate bonds and whatnot you can look to try and come up with your risk-free borrowing rate. I just want to touch on a couple more points to round out my discussion from what might also be considered useful information from looking at an accounting standards perspective. And I would like a bit of a short answer here, and maybe a bit biased given I'm a standard setter, but I really do think useful information from a pension perspective is that information you get from applying the international standards for either the private or the public sector. And that's for the simple reason that that gives you the full economic picture of the pension scheme. So when you're talking employee benefits, it's not just the pension liability, it's also how you plan to fund that liability and the nature of the schemes. As we've heard from earlier speakers today, many stakeholders and a wider group of stakeholders have a keen interest on how the pension liabilities will be settled over time. This is usually quite a hot topic for those using financial statements, and they're concerned with the large liabilities that arise from pensions, but also the resources that are available to fund those now and in the future, and how those schemes will be managed. And the accounting information you get from the international standards when applied provides a good basis for the effective management of pension schemes. It provides transparency for beneficiaries and other stakeholders to understand the nature of those schemes and their sustainability. And it also provides accountability in holding the entity and management to account for how the schemes are operated and for management of the entity as a whole, which I think is very important from a stakeholder perspective. And you have to remember that when you're thinking about accounting standards and what you get from a set of financial statements, you should really be thinking about the users who don't have the ability to demand the information. So the users that can really benefit from the transparency and accountability that a set of financials brings. So it's less for the entity preparing the statements, but more from the broader user group that benefits from understanding the schemes. And if you step back and look at the accounting you get from IPSAS 39 and IPSAS 42, it is really about those broader users and the information that helps them better understand the nature of the schemes, how they'll be funded, and their sustainability over time. And I really think that's important. And with that, I think the last thing I'd like to note is just a few developments internationally to keep in mind if you're interested in the accounting standard space in the pension accounting. So the ISB does have a research project ongoing at the moment. It's in the very early stages, but it's really looking at pension benefits that depend on asset returns in particular. So what's called capped benefit schemes and how that guidance might develop over time. Again, it's early days. It's not certain yet what the ISB will do, but it's likely if they do amend IS 19, it'll be for specific amendments to that standard to deal with these type of schemes, which would fall into the shared risk plans. And I did want to note that the IPSASB has been undertaking some academic research on the topic of discount rates in the public sector, and is looking at that, how to better deal with the discount rate issue in the public sector and reflect the time value of money. The IPSASB does not have an active project on its agenda as of yet, but this will be one of the topics that's considered in 2021 when the IPSASB consults on its next round of new projects to add to its work program. And with that, I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to speak on the accounting standard setters. I've really enjoyed listening to the discussions today. It's been very insightful for me as a standard setter, and I thank the Korean Institute of Public Finance for inviting me today.
감사합니다, 로스.
Thank you for your comments and insights, Mr. Ross. As he mentioned, pension accounting information in line with international accounting standards is useful because it is independent. Second, it can be generalized. It can be applicable to wider areas. We refer to Switzerland case, French case, and Japanese case in many cases. If criteria or underlying standards are different, it is really difficult to convince stakeholders. So, adopting international accounting standards means we will be able to provide more useful information to users, which are the general public of Korea. And IPSAS is also performing study on discount rate, and I expect some results of that study next year.
한국을 포함해서 각국의 공공부분 평균 기준을 제정하고 연구하는 사람들은
Those who work for setting accounting standards in Korea and in other countries, those public officials refer to the criteria of IPSAS many times. However, it is practically challenging to apply IPSAS criteria 100%. For example, in Korea, exchange and non-exchange transactions coexist in the public sector. I know that IPSAS is applying the revenue recognition criteria that is corresponding to IAB criteria, but we have a long way to go to catch up with that level, especially in terms of employee benefits. In Korea, we have a great desire to make advancements in public sector accounting system. Any comments from Mr. Baek-seung and Professor Hwan?
Yes, I explained before, so let me repeat myself. Korea's public pension system has both exchange transaction and non-exchange transaction elements. Therefore, it's necessary to recognize and disclose them separately. Then we can present a real picture of the scheme. In that regard, it's very important to explore the ways to distinguish the exchange transaction and the non-exchange transaction elements within the public officials' pension. As I said before, Korea's public pension plan is a defined benefit scheme. However, it is a unclear defined benefit scheme because the defined benefit changes due to different elements. Therefore, it is not confirmed defined benefit plan. However, in Korea, public officials' pension is regarded or considered as the employee benefit plan of a private sector. Therefore, we have to exactly understand the actual burden of the nation. Therefore, this will require the additional efforts. Thank you very much for your answer. So our discussion should finish at 4:20. So as I said before, I would like to ask you to share with us your finishing comment, starting with Deputy Director Paik. What will be the additional efforts you require from IPSASB, or what kinds of research you expect from Professor Bergman? So can you give us your final comment? Deputy Director Paik, you first. I'd like to point out that the pension provision is highly volatile because of the changes in actuarial assumptions. It is both affected by demographic changes and the financial situation, but I think that the changes in actuarial assumptions are the biggest cause for the volatility of the provision. In case of Korea's public officials' pension, for instance, the change caused by financial assumption accounts for about 60 to 70% of the total change in the provision. From the perspective of an organization which is responsible for measuring the provision, if a slight change in a financial factor such as discount rate causes bigger change in the provision than that is caused by the demographic factor, this may lead to public distrust or misunderstanding about the pension scheme. Therefore, I believe that IPSAS 39 should be improved concerning the use of discount rate that can more reasonably reflect the characteristics of a pension scheme.
네, 할인율 얘기를 다시
Yes, he mentioned of discount rate as a topic for additional research. So Fabienne, will you give us your final comment?
Fabienne, please share with us your final comments, please.
Thank you. I think that the discussions are very interesting, and it's very interesting to learn from other countries as well. And I'm quite interested in the approach with of Korea with the exchange, non-exchange distinction. I'm wondering with the IPSASB going taking steps to not use that distinction anymore. I'd be interested to see how that might be taken forward. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for providing the opportunity to exchange on that.
Thank you, Fabienne. 이어서 프로페서 안드레아스 교수님의
Professor Bergman, please give us your closing comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have had a very interesting discussion, and I particularly want to echo the concerns from Korea, whether the current accounting reflects the economic reality. And I think this is really crucial in my experience that we reflect the current reality. This is, of course, not the case if we do not present any liability when there is a liability. So very clearly, this would not reflect the economic reality. But of course, also if we represent a liability which is really not reflecting the actual situation, this could be misleading. Or if we, for instance, and this goes to your actuarial assumptions and in particular to interest rates, if we use interest rates and present values in schemes which are not investing into financial assets, this is very hard to understand. So why would you discount something which is not actually using the capital market? On the other hand side, if it is using the capital market, I think it is very understandable that you have to discount and that you have to reflect the interest rate. So really, I think my general recommendation and my general wish would be that we need to reflect as good as possible and as closely as possible the economic reality of the pension plans.
Thank you. 이어서 로타 교수님.
Professor Ryota, please.
Okay. Yes. So yeah, it's my great pleasure to talk about these pension issues, and I've learned a lot from this discussion. Yeah, and maybe to maintain our pension system sustainable, we should be more informed about our pension system and for the future. And I believe that accountants and accounting experts can play more important role in this field. Yeah, thank you and 감사합니다.
Thank you. 로스 국장님 마지막 코멘트 부탁드리겠습니다.
Director Ross, your last comment.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'd like to echo a couple comments that I've just heard that I think are quite important. I do think it's important that the accounting does reflect the economic substance, and the closer we get to that, the more helpful that information is over time. So I think that is an area where you'll see developments in the future. And I do think the important point that Professor Kaneko has just made is important, that accountants need to be part of the discussions around pension liabilities, and not just for the sake of accounting, but to make sure that they're sustainably managed, properly funded, and that the schemes are properly described. I think the accounting profession has an important role in that aspect of not just the pension accounting, but how pensions are managed to make sure they're sustainable over time. Along with a lot of government services, I think it's important that accountants are involved in the discussions and the debates, and that it's not just left to politicians alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. 저희 토론이
Thank you very much. I hope that our discussion provided useful information for the listeners. So the closing remark will be delivered by Professor Bong Hwan, and we will wrap up our discussion with his comment.
Thank you. I'm very privileged to be part of this symposium. I think I learned today there are more differences than I thought, even in OECD countries, how to recognize public pension liabilities. I understand the public pension is depend on the historical background and the institution and all the political decisions. Despite of that, I think we need to work on how to maintain comparability among countries, especially in OECD countries, and to assess sustainability of the pension program of each country and the ability to pay for each government. So in that regard, I'm looking forward to the role of IPSASB and the scholars in this symposium and KIPF, and I appreciate all organizing this symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Professor Chung and all the panel discussants for your insights. We poured a lot of effort and time to prepare for this symposium, but there were some technical glitches, so I ask for your understanding. Last but not least, Chief Director Kim Hwan of GAFSC of KIPF will make his closing remarks. Despite the time gap, many of the esteemed speakers joined us in the wee hours of a day. Thank you so much for your attention and participation. We spent a few months to make preparations for this first international symposium, and we surveyed a dozen countries to study their public pension accounting schemes. And we focused on 4 countries of Korea, Japan, Switzerland, and France. When a decision was made to host this international symposium, we expected that participants would be talking face-to-face, all the genuine and intimate talk about important issues that could be sensitive, but inevitable and essential to address. That was expected. So we expected that all the accounting experts would be able to gather together in person. That was what we expected, but as you can see, COVID-19 pandemic has changed everything. Now we are gathered online. So it's a shame, but it could be a blessing in disguise, I think, because a lot of insights were exchanged and there were a lot of hope for the future of public pension accounting. For example, we could save a lot of expenditures. For example, we are not spending on flight tickets and hotel accommodations, so that is good from accounting perspective, right? And also for the overseas participants, you can save your time and you can overcome language barrier easily due to translation services. So I think it could be a blessing in disguise. So we made another useful network today, I think. So building on this network we created, we will be able to further advancements going forward. This symposium aspires open discussions by holding events where concerns and issues of the public sector can be touched upon and delved into. So we are going to hold regular events like this so that different countries can share their concerns, identify the current issues that are discussed globally.
I would like to quote the famous French philosopher Voltaire. He said, "The present is pregnant with the future." 보다 나은 미래는
He said that a better future is born from the present. So a future depends on how faithfully we make preparations to brace for the future. The efforts we exert today will bear invaluable fruit for future generation. Once again, thank you so much for your dedication and for staying with us for long hours. And I hope the best success and health until we see together again.